What's going on, MMA fans? This is LTrain here again. Today I'm going to be breaking down the UFC Middleweight division. Just to go ahead and run it down, I got Anderson Silva, Chael Sonnen, Vitor Belfort, Nate Marquardt, Damian Maia, Wanderlei Silva, Michael Bisping, Yushin Okami, Chris Lieben, and Alan Belcher. That's my top 10. Anderson Silva, he's 11-0 in the UFC. He fights Chael Sonnen at UFC 117. He's pretty much looked invincible, even though his last 3 fights have been kind of questionable performances. Or his last 3 out of his last 4 fights have looked questionable in his performance. I don't know if it's cardio. I'm not really sure what it is. If it's just, blatant disrespect for the UFC. But he hasn't looked real good in those fights, so I'm kind of wondering to see how Chael Sonnen attacks Anderson Silva, because he's shown in the past that if you don't attack him, he'll just kind of play around with you a lot. So wonder to see how that goes. Number 2, Chael Sonnen. He's 4-3 in the UFC. He's on a 3-fight winning streak. He's won 3 out of 4 since returning to the UFC. He has wins over Nate Marquardt and Yushin Okami as of late to give him the title shot. And his only loss in the UFC since he's been back is Damian Maia. Number 3, I got Vitor Belfort. He's 8-4 in the UFC. He has wins over Wanderlei Silva and Rich Franklin. Rich Franklin's the only fight he's had since he's been back. He looked great in that fight, and then he's been off for a long time now. I'm wanting to see him back in. If he doesn't return soon, I'm going to have to drop him down in my rankings. I'm always been a real big fan of Vitor Belfort, and I think he, in the middleweight division, which is not the strongest in the UFC, I think he comes in right around number 3 talent-wise, but he doesn't have the fights to show it. Number 4, Nate Marquardt. He's got an 8-3 UFC record. He fights Rustamar Polaris at UFC 118. Marquardt has wins over Martin Kampmann and Damian Maia, and has losses to Anderson Silva and Chael Sonnen. Polaris, who he fights at 117, he's 4-1 in the UFC. He has wins over Jeremy Horn and Thomas Draw. His loss is to Dan Henderson. He's really good on the ground. I got him ranked at number 11 in my ranking. It's just, it could be a really good fight, because I believe Marquardt, he could stand with him, which I think would be the best bet, but sometimes he has a tendency to take guys down, and that might be a mistake against Polaris, because he's really good on the ground. He's been looking good as of late, and I just wanted to add him in there. Number 5, Damian Maia. He's got a 6-2 UFC record. He fights Alan Belcher at UFC Fight Night 22. He has wins over Chael Sonnen and Dan Miller, and his losses are to Nate Marquardt and Anderson Silva. Number 6, Wanderlei Silva. He only has a 3-5 UFC record, but he was the king of Pride, and he's only fought tough guys in the UFC. His wins are against Keith Jardine and Michael Bisping. He has losses to Chuck Liddell, Quentin Rampage Jackson, and Rich Franklin. They were all at the light heavyweight division, though. He's 1-0 as a middleweight since dropping down. I think this class suits him for his age and everything. I think this is a lot better class than him. For him to do well in light heavyweight is kind of stacked. I think the middleweight is a great division for him, and I'm interested to see when he comes back. I heard it might be against Chris Lieben, because he called him out. So that would be a wonderful fight. 2 guys going at it. I mean, they're going to throw down. 7, I have Michael Bisping. He's got a 9-3 UFC record. He fights Yakayama at UFC 120. His wins are against Chris Lieben, Matt Hamill, Dan Miller. losses to Vanderlei Silva, Dan Henderson, and Rashad Evans. Number 8, I have Yushin Okami. He's 8-2 in the UFC. He fights Mark Munoz at UFC on Versus 2. He has wins over Mike Swick and Alan Belcher, and losses to Chael Sonnen and Rich Franklin. Mark Munoz, I have him ranked at 12 in my rankings. He's got a 3-1 UFC record. He has a good win against Kendall Grove and a loss to Matt Hamill. He's 3-0 in the middleweight division. His first fight in the UFC was at light heavyweight. He got an impressive high head kick knockout loss to Matt Hamill, and then he immediately dropped down to middleweight, where he's looked good. His last fight against Kendall Grove, he was losing early and came back and won. It showed me a lot about him. I mean, he's got a lot of grit. He stays in fights when he's hurt, and I'm interested to see how he does against Yushin Okami. He's got good wrestling as well as Okami. So it's kind of interesting to see who controls that battle. At number 9, I have Chris Lieben. He's 11-5 in the UFC. Of course, he's been in the headlines recently. It's because he's had 2 wins in 2 weeks. The wins against Akiyama and Aaron Sampson in his last 2. Some of his losses are Anderson Silva and Michael Bisping. He kind of looks refocused now. He looks like all that experience is starting to take hand, and he's starting to really look good. He kind of, has in his career, he's had some losses that I didn't understand. I thought he was going downhill, and then, he starts training hard again. I think he's kind of put away some of the partying that he did when he was younger, and he's really starting to look good now. He's always an exciting fighter to watch, and I'm looking forward to his next fight. I mean, those 2 fights really got me pumped and got me to be a Chris Lieben fan again. I'm ready to see him again. Number 10, Alan Belcher. He's 7-4 in the UFC. He's kind of the same way. He's got some losses that that I thought he was better than some of the guys that he lost to, but I'm really psyched about him. He looked great against Patrick Cote. So I mean, his wins in his last 2 were Patrick Cote and Wilson Gavea. Wilson Gavea has kind of been dropped off as of late, but it's still a decent win. His losses are to Akiyama, which was razor close. I kind of thought that Belcher won that fight. And his another loss is to Yushin Okami. A couple guys I just want to mention is one's Jorge Rivera. I got him ranked 17th in my ranking. He's got a 7-5 UFC record. Been in the UFC for a long time. He's on a 3-fight win streak. He recently pulled out a fight against Alessio Sakara at UFC 118 because of injury. But Jorge Rivera, he looks like he's got a different focus now. He's had some issues in his life, some tragedy, and and he looks refocused and been looking great. His wins are Nate Marquardt and Kendall Grove. Some of his losses are Martin Kamen and Chris Lieben. Another guy I want to mention is Gerald Harris. I got him ranked 20. He's got a 3-0 UFC record. I mean, the kid looks great. His wrestling's great. He had that huge slam at the last UFC. Impressive knockout win. I hadn't seen a slam in a long time, and that was awesome. I love slam knockouts, and it's been a long time since there's been one. He doesn't really have any big wins. But, he's got powerful hands, good wrestling. I think he can definitely move up the rankings when he gets some bigger fights. He took the fight that Jorge Rivera dropped out of, and he's fighting Alessio Sakara at UFC 118. Some of the other fights I just want to point out that are coming up in the middleweight division. We got CB Dalloway versus Joe Dirksen at UFC 119. Patrick Cote versus Tom Lawler at UFC 121. And Court McGee makes his debut against Ryan Jensen at UFC 121. That's it, guys.